Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. Introduction. This is a history of the slave breeding industry, which we define as the complex of business and individuals in the United States who profited from the enslavement of African American children at birth. At the heart of our account is the intricate connection between the legal fact of people as property, the chattel principle, and national expansion. Our narrative doubles then as a history of the making of the United States as seen from the point of view of the slave trade. It also traces the history of money in America. In the southern United States, the peculiar institution of slavery was inextricably associated with its own peculiar economy, interconnected with that of the North. One of the two principal products of the antebellum slave economy was the staple crops, which provided the cash flow, primarily cotton, which was the United States' major export. The other was enslaved people who counted as capital and functioned as the stable wealth of the South. African American bodies and childbearing potential collateralized massive amounts of credit, the use of which made slave owners the wealthiest people in the country. When the Southern states ceded to form the Confederacy, they partitioned off and declared independence for their economic system in which people were money. Our chronology reaches from the earliest colonial times through emancipation. Following the two main phases of the slave trade, the first phase, which was importation, began with the first known sale of kidnapped Africans in Virginia in 1619 and took place largely, though not entirely, during the colonial period. The second phase, inbreeding, was the era of domestic or interstate slave trade in African Americans. The key date here, from our perspective, and one of the most important dates in American history, was the federal prohibition of the importation of persons as of January 1st, 1808. After that, the interstate trade was the major exception, the only slave trade in the United States, and it became massified on a previously impossible scale. The conflict between North and South is a fundamental trope of American history, but in our narrative, the major conflict is intra-Southern, the commercial antagonism between Virginia and the great slave breeder, between Virginia, the great slave breeder, and South Carolina, the great slave importer, for control of the market that supplied slave labor to an expanding slavery nation. The dramatic power struggle between the two was central to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and to secession in 1860. Part 1 is an overview intended as an extended introduction to the subject. Part 2 begins the main chronological body of the text, describes the creation of the slave economy during the colonial years. Part 3 centers on the U.S. Constitution's role as hinged between the two phases of slave importation and slave breeding. Parts 4 through 6 covered the years of the slave breeding industry from the end of the War of 1812 through emancipation, which was the rise, peak, and fall of the Cotton Kingdom. Author's note: this book describes an economy in which people were capital, children were interest, and women were routinely violated. We have tried to avoid gratuitously subjecting the reader to offensive language and images, but we are describing a horrifying reality. I will be right back, and we will start Chapter 1, Part 1, starting on page 1.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome, MG2 and Forecast. Thanks for tuning in, and everyone else that's out there listening. We're reading The American Slave Coast, a history of the slave breeding industry. We're starting on Chapter 1, Part 1, The Capitalized Womb, the mother of slavery. Virginia was the mother of slavery, wrote Lewis Hughes. It wasn't just a figure of speech. During the 53 years from the prohibition of the African slave trade by federal law in 1808 to the debacle of the Confederate States in America in 1861, the Southern economy depended on the functioning of a slave breeding industry, of which Virginia was the number one supplier. When Hughes was born in 1832, the market was expanding sharply. Quote, "My father was a white man and my mother was a negress," Hughes wrote. That meant he was classified as merchandise at birth because children inherited the free or enslaved status of their mother, not the father. It had been that way in Virginia for 170 years already when Hughes was born. Partus sequitur uterine was the legal term. The status of the newborn followed the status of the womb. Fathers passed inheritances down, mothers passed slavery down. It ensured a steady flow of sellable human product from the wombs of women who had no legal right to say no. Most enslaved African Americans lived and died without writing as much as their names. The Virginia Legal Code of 1849 provided for stripes, which was flogging, for those who tried to acquire literacy skills. A free person who dared to assemble with Negroes for the purpose of instructing them to read or write could receive a jail sentence up to 6 months and a fine of up to $100 plus costs. An enslaved person who tried to teach others to read might have part of a finger chopped off by the slave owner with the full blessing of the law. Greetings, Joe Friday. Thanks for tuning in. So, it was an especially distinguished achievement when in 1897, the 64-year-old Lewis Hughes published his memoir entitled 30 Years a Slave from Bondage to Freedom, the institution of slavery as seen on the plantation and in the home of the planter. Like the other volumes collectively referred to as slave narratives, it bears witness to a history slave owners did not want to exist, the first-hand testimony of the enslaved. By the time Hughes was 12, he had been sold 5 times. The third time, he was sold away from his mother to a trader. It was sad to part with her, he recalled, though she did not know that she would never see me again, for my master had said nothing to her regarding his purpose, and she only thought, as I did, that I was hired to work in the canal boat and that she would see me occasionally, but alas, we never met again. The trader carried the boy away from the Charlottesville area that had been his home, down the James River to Richmond. There he was sold a 4th time to a local man, but Hughes suffered with chills and fever, so the dissatisfied purchaser had him resold. This time he was sent to the auction block, where he was bought by a cotton planter setting up in the Potomac, Mississippi, a booming region that had recently become available for planters and plantations in the wake of the delivery of a large area of expropriated Chickasaw land into the hands of speculators. So as you can see, he had been sold many times, and as America was expanding and taking away Indian land, and they were giving land to white people, to planters, he was being sold to facilitate work on those plantations. Slaves were designated by geographical origin in the market, with Virginia and Maryland-born slaves commanding a premium. It was held by many that the Virginia slaves were the best, Hughes wrote. So when Mr. McGee found out where I was born and bred in that state, he seemed satisfied. The bidding commenced, and I remember well when the auctioneer said $380. Once, twice, sold to Mr. Edward McGee. McGee had plenty of financing, and he was in a hurry. He bought 60 other people that day. A prime field hand would have commanded double or more. But even so, the 380 that bought the sickly 12-year-old would be more than $10,000 in 2014 money. Like the largest number of those forcibly immigrated to the Deep South, McGee's captives were all made to walk from Virginia to Mississippi in a coffle. Southern children grew up seeing coffles approach in a cloud of dust. A coffle is a train of men and beasts fastened together, says the Oxford English Dictionary. And indeed, Lewis Hughes referred to the coffle as he marched in the herd. The word comes from the Arabic khalifa, meaning caravan, recalling the overland slave trade that existed across the deserts of the sub-Saharan Africa to the greater Islamic world centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. With the development in the late 15th century of the maritime trade that shifted the commercial gravity of Africa southward from the desert to the Atlantic coast, coffles were used to traffic Africans from one point of capture in their homeland to a point of sale in one of Africa's many slave ports. But the peoples trudging to Mississippi along with Lewis Hughes were not Africans. They were African Americans born into slavery and raised with their eventual sale in mind. Force marched through the wilderness at a pace of 20 or 25 miles a day for 5 weeks or more, from Can't See to Can't See in the blazing sun or cold rain, crossing unbridged rivers, occasionally dropping dead in their tracks. Hundreds of thousands of laborers transported themselves down south at gunpoint, where they and all of their descendants would expect to be prisoners for life. Perhaps 80% of enslaved children were born to two-parent families, though the mother and father might live on different plantations. But in extant slave traders' records of those sold according to Michael Tadsman analysis, complete nuclear families were almost totally absent. About a quarter of those trafficked southward were children between 8 and 15, purchased away from their families. The majority of coffle prisoners were male boys who would never again see their mothers, men who would never again see their wives, and children. But there were women and girls in the coffles too, exposed as were enslaved women everywhere to the possibility of sexual violation from their captors. The only age bracket in which females outnumbered males in the trade was 12 to 15, when they were able, as the boys, to do field labor and could also bear children. Charles Ball, forcibly taken from Maryland to South Carolina in 1805, recalled that the women were merely tied together with a rope about the size of a bed cord, which was tied like a halter around the neck of each. But the men were very differently capsized. A strong iron collar was closely fitted by means of a padlock around each of their necks. A chain of iron about 100 feet in length was passed through the hasp of each padlock, except at the two ends where the hasps of the padlock passed through the link of the chain. In addition to this, we were handcuffed in pairs with iron staples and bolts, with short chain about a foot long, uniting the handcuffs to their wearers in pairs. As they trampled along, coffles were typically watched over by whip and gun-wielding men on horseback and a few dogs with supply wagons bringing up the rear. In the country, coffles slept outdoors on the ground, perhaps in tents. In a town, they might have slept in the local jail or in a slave trader's private jail. Farmers along the route did business with the drivers, selling them quantities of the undernourishing monotonous fate that enslaved people are day in and day out. Sometimes manacles were taken off as the coffle penetrated farther south, where escape was nearly impossible. But since the customary way of disposing of a troublesome slave, whether criminally insane, indomitably rebellious, or merely a repeated runaway, was to sell him or her down south, drivers assumed that the captives could be dangerous. Couples were doubly vulnerable for robbery and for revolt, so security was very high. The captives were not generally allowed to talk among themselves as they trampled along, but sometimes, in the midst of their suffering, they were made to sing. The English geologist G.W. Featherstone-Laff, who in 1834 happened upon a huge annual Natchez-bound chain gang led by trader John Armfield, noted that the slave drivers endeavored to mitigate their discontent by feeding them well on the march and by encouraging them to sing Old Virginia Never Tired to the banjo. Thomas William Humes, who saw coffles and Virginia-born people passing through Tennessee in shackles on the way to the market, wrote, "It was pathetic to see them march thus bound through the towns and to hear their melodious voices in plaintive singing as they went." Sometimes coffles marched with fiddles at the head. North Carolina clergyman Jethro Rumpel recalled them stepping off with a huzzah. On the day of departure for the West, the trader would have a grand jollification. A band, or at least a drum and fife, would be called into requisition, and perhaps a little rum be judiciously distributed to heighten the spirits of the sable property, and the neighbors would gather in to see the departure. Rumpel was speaking of, needless to say, of heightened spirits, of young people who had just been ripped away from their parents and were being taken to a fate many equated not incorrectly with death. A coffle might leave a slave jail with more people than it arrived with. The formerly enslaved Sister Shackelford, Sis Shackelford, described the process at Virginia's Five Forks Depot as transcribed by the interviewer. Had a slave jail built in the crossroads with them iron bars across the windows. Soon as the coffles get there, they bring it to all the slaves to the jail, 2 of them at a time, sitting in them. Long the chains back of the other pole slaves. Everybody in the village come out, especially the wives and the sweethearts and the mothers, to see they sold off children for the last time. And when they start the chain clanking and step off down the line, they all just sing and shout and make all the noise they can, trying to hide their sorrow in their hearts and cover up the cries of moaning and them cries the leaving behind. An enslaved person could always be sold to another owner at any time. With Lewis Hughes' coffle reaching Edenton, Georgia, McGee sold 21 of his newly purchased captives, taking advantage of the price differential in the lower South to post an immediate profit on a third of his Virginia transaction and thereby hedge his debt to his financer. Charles Ball described a deal that took place on the road in South Carolina. The stranger, who was a thin, weather-beaten, sunburned figure, then said he wanted a couple of breeding wenches and would give as much for them as they would bring in Georgia. He then walked along our line as we stood chained together and looked at the whole of us. Then, turning to the women, asked the prices of the two pregnant ones. Our master replied that these were two of the best breeding wenches in all of Maryland, that one was 22 and the other only 19, that the first was already the mother of 7 children and the other 4, that he had himself seen the children at the time he brought their mothers, and that such wenches would be cheap at $1,000 each, but that they were not able to keep up with the gang. He would take $1,200 for the two. The purchaser said this was too much, but that he would give $900 for the pair. So as you can see, they commoditized their pregnancy. They probably were lying about how many children these women actually had in order to increase the price. This price was promptly refused by our masters, after some consideration, said he was willing to sell a bargain in these 2 wenches and would take $1,100 for them, which was objected to on the other side, and many faults and failings were pointed out in the merchandise. After much bargaining and many gross jests on the part of the stranger, he offered $1,000 for the 2 and said he would give no more. He then mounted his horse and moved off. But after he had gone about 100 yards, he was called back, and our master said if he would go with him to the next blacksmith shop on the road to Columbia and pay for the irons off and pay for the taking of the irons off the rest of us, he might have the 2 women. Women with babies in hand were particularly in a cruel situation. Babies weren't worth much money, and they slowed down coffles. Williams Wells Brown, hired out to a slave trader named Walker, recalled seeing a baby given away on the road. Soon after we left St. Charles, says William Wells Brown, the young child grew very cross and kept up a noise during the great part of the day. Mr. Walker complained of its crying several times and told the mother to stop the child's damned noise, or he would. The woman tried to keep the child from crying, but couldn't. We put up at night with the acquaintance of Mr. Walker, and in the morning, just as we were about to start, the child again commenced to crying. Walker stepped up to her and told her to give him the child. The mother, trembling, obeyed. He took the child by one arm, as you would a car by the leg, walked it into the house, and said to the lady, "Madam, may I present you with this little nigger, which keeps up such a noise that I can't bear it?" "Thank you, sir," said the lady. From the first American coffles to rough wilderness treks along trails established by the indigenous people, there were the cheapest and most common way to transport captives from one region to another. The federally built National or Cumberland Road, which by 1818 reached from the Ohio River port of Wheeling, Virginia, subsequently West Virginia, was ideal for coffles. It was the nation's first paved highway, with bridges across every creek, laying out approximately the route of the future of US 40. Its broken stone surface provided a westward overland transportation link that began at the Potomac River of Cumberland, Maryland. From Wheeling, the captives could be shipped by riverboat down to the Mississippi River and on to the Deep South's second largest slave market at Natchez, or further on to the nation's largest slave market, New Orleans. Beginning after the War of 1812 and continuing up through the Secession, captive African Americans were trafficked south and west by every possible method in an enormous forced migration. A drove of slaves on a southern steamboat bound for the cotton or sugar regions, wrote William Wells Brown in his 1849 autobiography, is an occurrence so common that no one, not even the passengers, appeared to notice it, though they clanked their chains at every step. As railroads extended their reach, captives were packed like cattle into freight cars, shortening the time and expense to market considerably. Some passenger trains had servant cars, though a cruder term was more commonly used. On his first trip to the South in January of 1859, the 21-year-old New Englander J. Pierpont Morgan noted 1,000 slaves on trains. They were trafficked by sea in ocean-going vessels that sailed the hard passage from the Chesapeake found around the Florida Peninsula to New Orleans, as well as in shorter voyages within that route. Ocean shipment was more expensive than a coffle, but it was quicker, so it turned the capital-intensive human cargo over more efficiently. Though exact figures do not exist, it is safe to say that in the tens of thousands of African Americans made the crosswise voyage from Chesapeake to the Charleston to New Orleans and up the Mississippi to Natchez, as well as to Pensacola, Mobile, Galveston, and other ports. Maryland ports alone, principally in Baltimore, shipped out 11,966 people for whom records exist between 1818 and 1853, and an unknown number of others before, during, and after that time. More slave ships came to New Orleans from the east coast of the United States than from Africa. In a shorter recapitulation of the Middle Passage of the century before, the captives were packed into the hold with ventilation slots along the side to keep them from suffocating. Upon arrival, they were discharged into one or another of New Orleans' many slave pens, where they were washed, groomed, and fed. Their skin was oiled, and their gray hairs, if they had any, were dyed or plucked out. On sale day, they were put into suits of the finest clothes many of them had ever seen, with perhaps even top hats for the men. Most would be sent to the cotton fields, where inhuman levels of work would be extracted from them through torture, or to Louisiana's death camps of sugar. Following the precedent set by the Europeans, who referred to the coastal regions of Africa by their exports, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, some were referred to as the Chesapeake regions as the Tobacco Coast. But it would also be appropriate to call it the American Slave Coast. Protectionism, or the importance of 1808. Industry is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a particular form or branch of productive labor. By hemispheric standards, the African slave trade to English-speaking North America was petty. According to the database-backed estimates by David Eltis and David Richardson, only about 389,000 kidnapped Africans were disembarked in the ports of the present-day United States, the majority of them before independence. We say only. That's an enormous number of captives to be dragged across the ocean. But Africans trafficked to the United States territory account for less than 4% of the estimated hemispheric total. An estimated 10.7 million Africans arrived alive to the Americas out of the estimated 12.5 million embarked, leaving 1.8 million dead at sea. There is no way to figure out the collateral damage to African populations from slave raiding with even a rough level of accuracy. Slave trading, which was typically conducted by Africans, was notoriously wasteful of life, since only the young were taken and often the rest were killed off. You know that's a puff piece right there. That's some of their propaganda where they say only the young were taken. They took the scholars, they took the tradesmen, they took men, women, and children. If one died for every one taken captive in slave raids, a speculative and possibly conservative number, that would mean the transatlantic slave trade killed or enslaved some 25 million Africans. It may have been double that. There's no way to know. Barbados, an island about the size of New York City's borough of Queens, appears to have taken in more Africans than the entire territory of the present-day United States, 493,000, according to Eltis and Richardson. Estimates vary, of course. Historian James McMillan believes that the number for the United States and its colonial predecessors exceeded 500,000, but that difference is not an order of magnitude. Some captives were brought to North America from Barbados and other places in the West Indies, especially in the 17th century. While documentation is scarce, the numbers were small by comparison. Africans were only the seed. By 1860, those few 100,000 Africans had given way to 4 million African Americans. Each birth was, as Thomas Jefferson described it, an addition to the capital, as in money. The South did not only produce tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton as commodities for sale, it produced people. Virginia had been slave breeding since the 17th century. It had the oldest, most deeply rooted African American populations and the largest, with far more slaves than any other state, and with much of the land already burned for those tobacco farming. By the time of the Declaration of Independence, the agricultural productivity per laborer in Virginia was low. The most profitable thing for Virginia planters to do with their growing slave population was to sell young people to traders for shipment down south. The existence of slavery in the United States was taken for granted by the delegates of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There was little or no discussion about abolishing it. The African slave trade, however, was very much in contention. None of the delegates assembled at the Constitutional Convention could know that there would soon be a revolution in Saint Domingue for the future Haiti, much less that as a consequence, Napoleon Bonaparte would make a snap decision to sign his claim to Louisiana over to the United States in 1803. But it was commonly understood that territorial expansion was coming. Everyone knew that the upper hinterlands of New Orleans was being invaded by Anglo-American settlers who would eventually take the territory over through force of numbers. Charleston merchants had a long-established web of overland trade that spread 1,000 miles across Georgia and what we now call Alabama and Mississippi into Louisiana. The frontiermen of Kentucky and Tennessee were itching to drive the Native Americans out of Alabama and take their rich Black land. Spanish Florida had from the beginning been a security threat to South Carolina and Georgia. It too would come under U.S. control. The market for slaves was about to explode in volume, and everyone knew it. The question of who would have the concession to supply slave labor to this plantation empire to come was an obstacle to unity at the Constitutional Convention. Slave owners in Virginia and in smaller numbers Maryland were uniquely positioned to sell slaves into the emerging markets. Unlike the sugar slaves in the rest of the Americas or the rice slaves in South Carolina, the tobacco slaves of the Chesapeake didn't die off. It was an unprecedented phenomenon in the hemisphere. Their numbers increased every single year. Prohibiting the African trade, as the New England delegates wanted to do, would create a grand bonanza for Virginia slaveholders at the expense of South Carolina. But the delegates from Virginia had to compromise if they wanted South Carolina and Georgia to be a part of the nation instead of an independent, belligerent, slave importing competitor for power next door. Moreover, those whose territory was the overland gateway to territorial expansion into the Deep South. Charleston, meanwhile, was the major receiving port in North America for kidnapped Africans, and South Carolina's delegates wanted no federal interference in their market-driven opening and closing of the trade. Chesapeake slave owners, who were the only ones with sufficient surplus of labor to sell off, wanted the African trade permanently closed. They compromised on a 20-year guarantee that the foreign slave trade could exist on a state-by-state basis. Accordingly, Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution reads, "The migration or importation of such persons of any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or a duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person." So instead of outlawing slavery, they said you can keep it going until 1808, but you have to pay $10 a head to get those slaves from Africa in here. Importation of persons was a euphemism. The farmers were not so indelicate as to use the word slave. It was an anonymous provision containing as it did the only date in the Constitution, and moreover, the only price, the $10 duty limit, which guaranteed that the African slave trade could not be taxed out of existence, but implied that the slave trade might contribute revenue to the federal budget. The constitutionally stipulated deadline of January 1st, 1808 is, from our perspective, one of the most important dates in American history, signaling, as it does, the transformation of the United States slavery industry. For this reason, 1808 is also an essential date for the understanding the making of the African American culture. Kidnapped Africans had been arriving for almost 200 years, repeatedly re-Africanizing American culture. No longer. The child was separated from the ancestors. With the changeover to a domestic slave trade, the long established Afro-Chesapeake culture of Virginia and Maryland was diffused southward over several decades. Meanwhile, there was an overland march westward of the more recently Africanized low country of Carolina and Georgia across Alabama and into Mississippi and Louisiana, as well as vessels sailing around Florida to New Orleans. The two collided with each other in the presence of the smaller but potent creolized culture of Catholic Afro-Louisiana. So 1808 is a critical date in African American folklore. It should be a year that we remember and that we commemorate as Africans in America, because that's when they tried to do this whole thing where they stopped the transatlantic slave trade and they made the slave breeding farms more prevalent here in this country. So if FBA was looking for additional documentation, that's a date that they should latch on to. As an African in America, I go back to older dates because they have done other things to us that were more horrific. But when we talk about slave breeding, we need to note that date because that was a date when things significantly shifted for us in this hemisphere. While the forces involved were greater than any single historical figure, individuals do make a difference in history. We will interpret key events and figures of American history in the light of their relationship to the profit-seeking machine African Americans were caught in. In particular, three slave-owning politicians loom large in our narrative as principal enablers of the territorial expansion of slavery and consequently of the slave breeding industry. They were Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and James K. Polk, a Virginian and two Tennesseans. Beings, so their entire financial base, personal, familial, social, and political, depended on high prices for slaves. To that end, they restricted the supply of captives by keeping the African trade closed. By opening new territory for U.S. slavery to expand into, they expanded the demand for the great restricted supply, greatly increasing as they did, so that the wealth and political power of the slave-owning class was increased. 14 years after the Constitution went into effect, on December 20th, 1803, the territorial area of the new nation approximately doubled when French Governor Pierre Clement de Lussat handed New Orleans over to President Jefferson and his men. The Virginia-born W.C.C. Claiborne and the Maryland-born James Wilkinson. From that date until Louisiana became a state in 1812, the territory was effectively a colony of Virginia. Jefferson's pointedly undemocratic rule of the Louisiana Territory assured favorable regulatory treatment for Virginia slave owners. He asked Congress for, and got, monopolistic commercial restrictions on the slave trade into Louisiana, importation into Louisiana of slaves from outside of the United States was prohibited, but importation into Louisiana of slaves from within the United States was allowed. So they couldn't take slaves out of Louisiana, but they could bring slaves into Louisiana. Isn't that crazy? With the Constitution having set the rules of the match, Virginia and South Carolina were in direct competition to supply the growing Louisiana slave market. It was an enormous business opportunity for Charleston's slave dealers, but time was running out. The 20-year constitutional guarantee of protection for the African slave trade that South Carolina had insisted on had only 4 years to run. While Jefferson proactively worked to be sure that the window was closed at the first possible moment, the Carolina merchants scurried to take maximum advantage of it. South Carolina legislators knew full well that the prohibition of the African slave trade by federal law was on President Jefferson's action list. Accustomed to turning the trade on or off as economic conditions dictated, they rescinded their previous ban against the African trade as soon as the news of the acquisition of Louisiana arrived at the end of 1803. Disregarding the anger the move provoked elsewhere, they opened the port of Charleston to cargoes of kidnapped Africans. Louisiana couldn't legally import Africans, but South Carolina could, and they could resell the Africans to Louisiana via the domestic trade. Even with substantial markups, they could still undercut the price Virginia farmers charged for African Americans. The Constitution did not require the federal prohibition of the importation of persons as of 1808. It merely stipulated that federal law could not prohibit it before that date. But Jefferson, who legally owned more than 600 people during his lifetime, proactively made sure that importation of persons would indeed be prohibited as of the earliest constitutionally permissible date, so as not to have slave importation one day more than necessary. On December 2nd, 1806, he gave his 6th annual message and asked Congress for a measure to end the African trade more than a year before it would become effective. It was a move that was to his personal financial gain as a Virginia slave owner and to the disadvantage of South Carolina's wholesale slave importers. To be sure, Jefferson framed ending importation of persons as a humanitarian act, and many historians have treated it that way, but it was not. Ending the African slave trade was the protectionism on behalf of Virginia. It kept out the cheaper African imports so as to keep the price of domestically raised people high. Nobody in Chesapeake politics wanted more Africans coming in and devaluing their most significant assets. Over the long term, ending the African trade was a business coup on behalf of slave owners in Virginia, who were Jefferson's most loyal constituents throughout his increasingly disastrous second term as president, which was from 1805 to 1809. Moreover, ending the foreign slave trade to the United States was popular among other groups as well. Few white people wanted more black people in the country. Anti-slavery people wanted the African trade suppressed. The Southern public approved of ending the foreign slave trade as an anti-terrorism measure. They were alarmed by the discovery of Gabriel's planned uprising in 1800, terrified by the bloody chain of events that had produced the newly declared nation of Haiti, and always frightened of the ever-present possibility of slave rebellion at their door. These three things are in the psyche of white people to this very day, and they have issues with African American liberation because they think that we're going to plot, plan, and execute them because of what they did to us during slavery. But not everyone was happy about the prohibition of the African trade. Louisiana and Mississippi's burgeoning planter population wanted all the slave labor it could get. But once foreign sources were shut off pursuant to Jefferson's signature, no states besides Virginia and Maryland had quantities of laborers ready to sell. The French Creoles of Louisiana were particularly angry at having to pay higher prices to the Virginians for English-speaking slaves they could have gotten Africans much cheaper via Havana. But the United States shifted over to an entirely domestic slave trade in African Americans as of 1808, albeit with some ill-documented smuggling of captives from outside for 10 years or so, particularly the Lafitte brothers' operation in Louisiana and Spanish Texas. In a frenzy of last-minute stocking up during the last legal year in 1807, South Carolina merchants imported the highest one-year volume of Africans in the history of the North American trade, with the result that the market became glutted with captives from diverse parts of Africa died on Gadsden's Wharf awaiting sale. Though the end of the African slave trade was a major commercial shift, its immediate impact was eclipsed by mercantile catastrophes. Only a few days before the African trade ban went into effect, one of the most radical economic actions ever taken by a president, Jefferson put an embargo on all foreign commerce rather than respond militarily to naval aggression by the British and the French. From then until 1815, American business was paralyzed, first by the embargo, then by the war, during which time the large-scale domestic slave trade could not develop, but it grew spectacularly after that. With the African trade halted, those slaves that continued to be bought and sold and brought profit to U.S. slave owners, speculators, and slave trading firms instead of to British syndicates and African royals. Slavery required a slave trade, and with the trade in kidnapped Africans shut off, there was no slave trade without slave breeding. By deliberately creating a scarcity of slave labor from which profit could derive for those who could supply it, The 1808 cutoff of the African trade created an economic incentive for farmers to deliver as many homegrown laborers to market as possible as fast as possible. The Maine-born Episcopal clergyman Joseph Holt Ingram, writing under deep cross-gendered cover as Kate Cunningham, reported from Virginia in 1850 that so necessary is the annual decimation of slaves by sale to support these old decayed families that it has become a settled trade for men whose occupation is to buy slaves to travel through the old dominion from estate to estate. Here he gets one, there another, and in a few weeks he enters Lynchburg, Alexandria, or Richmond with 100 or more. As it is, slaves are raised here more as marketable and money returning commodity than for their productive labor. For Virginia's African Americans, Jefferson's legacy was unspeakably cruel. When the prohibition of importation of Africans made a massive business of the already existing interstate slave trade in African Americans, Black Virginians and Marylanders were trafficked in mass quantities to the newly opened territories, destroying family ties with every sale. The human cargoes that were driven in coffles and loaded onto ships were assembled by a network of traders, agents who fanned out through the farming territories of the Chesapeake, combing the slave producing region to buy, one would say, harvest young people from farmers, often one at a time. With the acreage under cultivation vastly expanding, the slave selling industry touched the lives of everyone in the slave zone, free or enslaved. It put a price on everyone, including the slave owners whose wealth was stored in the bodies of their always liquidatable slaves and whose available credit was a function of the size of their slave holdings. In the absence of a domestic supply of coin, slaves collateralized the credit that created new money. The growing nation of fortunate hunters exerted a popular pressure to wrest more cotton growing land from the Native Americans, a mission notably carried out by General Andrew Jackson under the cover of the War of 1812, creating the land and slaves boom remembered as Alabama fever. Jackson's subsequent taking of Florida by military conquest and removing the South's remaining Native Americans from their ancestral lands, we now call it ethnic cleansing, made the entire Deep South safe for plantation slavery and further increased the demand for slave labor. President James Monroe, a Virginian, as were all of his predecessors in the office except John Adams, cracked down on what remained of the clandestine African trade, signing into law in 1820 a bill that declared participation in the foreign slave trade to be piracy and, as such, was punishable by death. These white people be serious about their money, don't they? They are serious about their money. For the next 45 years, the enslaved population of the United States was a closed system that expanded its numbers through sexual reproduction, more politely referred to as natural increase. As W.E.B. Du Bois described it, slaves without the African slave trade became more valuable. With cotton culture, their value rose still further, so that they were fed adequately and their breeding systematically encouraged. Over time, more states, including South Carolina, got into the business of exporting African Americans to new territories. While the North developed cities and industries, the South failed to build an infrastructure through which consumer goods could be distributed and thus furnished no domestic market. Instead, its profitable system of plantation prisons expanded to new lands through imperial and military effort. After the worst depression the nation had yet suffered, President James K. Polk prosecuted the Mexican War to annex Texas for the Southern Cotton Kingdom, an action wholly contested by John Quincy Adams in the House and generally unpopular in the North. Once Texas was in the Union, Southern slave prices continued to climb with only brief dips until secession. Polk's success in expanding the Southern slave regime to Texas instantly and predictably revalued slave owners' human portfolios upward, including his own. Polk bought slaves in secret from his office in the White House and on an ongoing basis during his presidency in the hope of building up his nest egg while he worked to extend the reach of American slavery. So he was in office using his office to enrich himself. A century and a half later, what vocabulary to use in talking about this is still something of a work in progress. It's hard to describe business without employing a business vocabulary. That said, economists who have written on the subject have sometimes used the antebellum business vocabulary too readily, as in the 1858 study that made the hypothetical assumption that each prime field wench produced 5 to 10 marketable children during her lifetime. The history of slavery is a study in euphemisms, beginning with the near universal use by refined whites of the polite term servant to refer to the individuals they legally owned. The colloquial term of choice used by slave traders, more often spoken than written, was, of course, nigger, or more politely, Negro, which was considered synonymous with slave. Judging from available evidence, the N word was used by the enslaved themselves as freely as it is on playgrounds today, even as the vocabulary of slavery sometimes echoes in colloquial Black speech, things like bitch, buck, and the ultimate curse, motherfucker. A number of people presently prefer to say enslaved person or some similar construction instead of slave, arguing that Africans and African Americans never accepted their enslaved condition. This phrasing can become cumbersome in an extended discussion, and in talking about our subject, it can lead to a paradox of parallel constructions. If one is not a slave, then one has no owner, and one could not be sold. True enough on a moral level, but unfortunately, what we are describing is precisely the legal ownership and sale of slaves. We have chosen generally and perhaps not entirely consistently to use the words enslaved or captive to refer to people in their human aspect and slave to refer to their economic function and social position. And we hope the reader will cut us some slack. The term slave breeding was much in use when this was happening, hurled as a charge on the floor of Congress and denounced as a damned lie by slave owners. But it wasn't merely an allegiance. Slave breeding was an ugly term that described a horrific reality. Our ambivalence about terminology extends to the naming of wars, which is a highly political pursuit. Slavery ended as a consequence of what American history generally chooses to remember by the name of the Civil War, and which in official U.S. documents was called the War of Rebellion. But revolutions generally are civil wars and vice versa. We argue that, depending on one's perspective, the most common names for the two great national conflicts, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, could be flipped. In recent years, it has become more common for scholars to speak of the War of Independence from Britain, commonly memorialized as the Revolutionary War, as a civil war, as indeed it was frequently described during the independence struggle. We will argue that the War of Independence not only did not intend to end slavery, but was fought in part to protect slavery from the growing power of British abolitionism. From the perspective of the enslaved, meanwhile, the war usually called the Civil War was the Revolutionary War because it ended chattel slavery. And in removing the appraised resale value of human beings from the balance sheets, remade the basis of American money. So as you can see, they have a very particular perspective that they are coming from. They are making an attempt to argue that slave breeding, when it occurred, should be the name of the wars should be reversed, and that slave breeding was as American as apple pie, and that Jefferson, Polk, and Jackson all made attempts to increase their particular financial standings by changing the nature of slavery. But it was not some benevolent humanitarian reason that they wanted to end the transatlantic slave trade. It was to benefit themselves financially. So as we delve into this book, we will continue to learn and understand what it is that happened in the slave breeding industry in America. There's also some propaganda in this book that we can point out, that not a lot of slaves came over here in the transatlantic slave trade, but they highlight the fact that families were consistently ripped apart. So I like this text for that reason. If anyone would like to come up, the link is in the chat. Joe Friday says that we are perpetual victims, really sick. I hope he's not here. I hope that he understands that we're just reading to learn and understand these different perspectives of things that happened. If you have a problem with it, you are always free to leave, and we wish you well. This is not your space. This is my space. This is our space. All right. So, one of the things I want you to know is that they are all in on it. We cannot hide from that reality. We cannot sit and say, oh no, these people are our friends. because they were all in on the slave breeding industry. They were all in on slavery. They all wanted to put themselves in a better position and the slave in a worse position. They wanted to put themselves in a better financial position using the institution of slavery. Using the institution of slavery, they all wanted to put themselves in a better position. Polk just came right out and did it, making deals from the White House to buy more slaves to build himself a nest egg. Jefferson hid behind the veneer of being a humanitarian, and Jackson committed genocide in an attempt to uh, increase his wealth. So, as you can see, there are a lot of things that we need to talk about. I want to thank the Forecast for being here. I want to thank MG2 for being here. I want to thank you. I know that Koku is here. I know that KW Don 7 is here. I know that Raw and the Elders are here. I know that Afro Native is here. I know that Oni from the Pro Black Perspective is here, and so many others. I appreciate and value each and every one of you for tuning in. I appreciate and value each and every one of you for tuning in. I thank you for listening, and I will be back with this reading next Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Give me one moment. Greetings, MG2. How are you tonight?
Oh, doing wonderful. Oh my goodness. I am just digging this program. My goodness. I mean, just how thorough that the readings are. And I think I have Slave Coast. I may have an audio version of it as an audiobook that my mom gave me. And I just love the insight that you give, in terms of some of the commentary, because I think what has happened is we've lost sight in terms of the depth and the magnitude. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Professor Nwalamuke Baruti.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with his works. I know you're familiar with Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Eric Williams. And the depths of, I think what it is the magnitude of not only just what we've been through in terms of the day to day, but also the breeding, what it's done to families, what it's done to our minds. It's actually created an epigenetic, for lack of a better term, effect on us. And I see it just on our just the day to day when I'm out and about walking, and I see the impact. You could see it in the people's eyes, in Black folks' eyes, and how we relate to one another, how we relate to the world. It's almost, I won't say in a defeatist nature, but it's or being conquered, but it's not very far away, And I see it across the board. I see it in the way we talk to each other. I see it the way. I mean, it's been so impacting. I think it's almost like, how can I say this? It's unconscious. When I say unconscious, it's that we've normalized it so much that we can't even see just how deep the rabbit hole gets, just how impacting this stuff has hurt us. We've kind of normalized a lot of things. I think of some of the current events right now in terms of what's happening, especially like that young brother Carmelo Anthony and what he's going through. I see it with, I was watching or listening to this so-called Gayle King thing go into space, and I was like, she really has no concept in terms of, the fact that we've assimilated so much into somebody else. It's like, even though it might seem innocuous that, hey, we're just part of this, country, whatever else, that also speaks volumes of the impact of this breeding, and not just breeding physically, but breeding everything from spirit to psychology to education, whole 9 yards. I mean, it's just like I said, I can't thank you enough for this program, because I get to thinking about it. When I'm out and about walking, and I see the impact so deep that it's like, man, if Black folk could see how this is, how much is done to us, then maybe we might take another course in terms of what we do on our day to day or how we relate to everyone else. The reason I ask you about Mwalimu Kebaruti is he's got a program he does every year called Kebuka. And Kebuka, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is
I'm not
literally,
familiar with Kebuka.
oh my goodness. Oh, I mean, anytime you get a chance to study Mwalimu Kebaruti, he is probably one of the most foremost scholars of modern day in terms of what had happened to us in terms of the enslavement of African people. And it's not just the African people in Africa, but it's greater impact on what we do on these conversations we have even here, you know, or the conversations you see that happen in other diasporas, whether it's Britain or wherever else. But Kebuka goes through it goes through what's the Maafa, you know, and basically it goes through the Kafa lines, because a lot of folks don't know the depths of the Kafa lines. But I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of it. Africans had to walk 10 weeks, sometimes, you know, 1,100 to 1,200 miles walking with no breaks, you know, almost like, you know, you would do cattle or horses, and they would have to walk from the interior Africa to the coast. If you see the magnitude of how many of us were lost, a lot of folks say, oh, 12 million slaves. They like to minimalize what has happened. Of course, I expect my enemy to do that. You know, so, you know, I wouldn't, you know, it doesn't anger me or anything. It just knows that I have a serious enemy out there. But if you see what happened, only 1 out of the 5 out of millions that were going through those coffles, 1 out of 5 actually made it. And then once they got to the coast, some Africans never even saw the coast. But once they got to the coast, and they got in those dungeons, 1 out of every 3 actually made it out of those dungeons. Okay, and then once they got from the dungeons to the on the ships, you know, by the time they were on those slave ships, 1 out of 5, I think it's like 1 out of 5 made it to wherever they were going, whatever coast, whether it was Arab, whether it was, you know, South America, United States, it doesn't matter where it was. And then once they were there, they also were in slave pens. So only 1 out of 3. So if you see the magnitude of how many Africans of our folks were impacted and destroyed, we're talking like over 156 million. That's why I say they like to minimalize the number. And it's very simple. I do this. I do a study on this, and I do videos on this off and on, showing the actual math behind it in terms of how many of us. But we're looking at over 156 million of us that were killed. You know, and one of the things that Mwalimu Kebaruti goes through, he says, when the Africans got to those coasts, when they call it the door of no return, a lot of us minimalize it and romanticize it because the pain is so intense. I mean, if you could see the pain when they do that program on Kebuka, you could actually feel the pain that a lot of us kind of like we gloss over it. I can't gloss over that kind of pain. We're talking about, you know, like there were so many Africans that died in those Kafa lines, that animals like hyena, lion, leopards, and stuff like that actually go toward gazelle and, you know, things that they've been hunting forever. Those animals didn't need to eat those. So you have an overpopulation of like ungulates and stuff like that like wildebeest and impala and stuff like that. You had such an overpopulation because there were so many dead African bodies stacked up for miles that sometimes it was almost up to the shoulder height of and we're talking like miles of bodies up to shoulder height of women, children, men. It didn't matter who it was, you know. Everything from the rapes in the Kafa lines. I mean, it was just something that, like I said, the pain you can't even imagine with folks. Because, you know, if you're walking for 1,200 miles, there's a lot of folks that can't even walk 1 mile. And they would just cut off the arm and just leave the body. And that's why a lot of the animals didn't have to hunt. You know, they just never had to because there was so much fresh African meat for like leopards, lions, and stuff to eat. So you had, and so they've really not only changed nature on the African continent, but they've also changed nature in the water. If you see these shark attacks that happen like in South Carolina, Florida, and stuff like that, the reason that is because sharks for millions of years knew a certain temperature of the water that they could hunt in. But there was, like I said, over 156 million of us at the minimum. There were so many African bodies that were over those ships. Again, a lot of folks gloss over it and they minimalize it. That it actually, sharks never had to go hunt like they did. They actually changed the shark's nature to this very day. Sharks are still thinking that they could get African meat because they've actually tuned the shark's the fact that how sharks live nowadays, and that's why you see them on all those southern areas, because sharks normally did not hunt like that. They normally, there's a certain temperature of the water, like in San Francisco and stuff like that, where great whites and stuff like that, and they were used to. But we actually, like I said, the impact and the pain that went behind it, that happened to us, it never stopped. Okay, and just think about it. So many bodies were over those ships, that something that's been around for millions of years, because sharks have been around for millions of years, that they actually changed the actually physiology of an animal to this very day. So there's so much behind it that I think that is not told to us, because of the pain, because of we want to fit into someone's society, because we feel that maybe it's embarrassment, some of it is self-hate. There's so much that I think that needs to be researched, that I'm so glad what you're doing, that I mean, this is like scratches the surface of what's been happening. But anyways, I'm pretty loquacious. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic. I just wanted to thank you so much for this.
I appreciate your loquaciousness, because you give so much meaning, depth, and context to what it is I'm saying. You enhance every conversation and every discussion that we have. So I appreciate you. So thank you for coming up. And we do underestimate the pain. We are trying to hide the pain. So many people don't even talk about the different aspects of the African American slave trade, or the slave trade in and of itself, and how this cave beast has destroyed and disrupted nature in ways that can't be fixed, because of their decision to try to extract value from every single living thing out of the earth and out of the African. We don't talk about the fact that we have been epigenetically changed based on our encounters with them, and that other animals have been epigenetically changed, have been forever changed, because this white man exists. That's why we have to do everything we can to make an attempt to restore African world order. That's why we have to do the things that we need to do in order to restore true harmony to nature, so that these animals aren't hunting us, so that these animals can go back to culling the other herds that they need to cull, instead of having all these wild animals just roaming the earth, hunting things that they shouldn't be hunting. And we need to really look at, from the inside out, how we are impacted by these things, and how these things have harmed us. Because when we deny the harm, we're continuing the harm, and we continue to allow them to do things that are harmful to us as a people. Because if we don't ever confront the problem, it's like we're trying to run from it or ignore the problem. Like you said, we're trying to integrate into a society that is not our society. We don't do things the way that they do things. We have an entirely different worldview and perspective. And they've been trying for hundreds of years to force us into their worldview and perspective. And they're afraid that if we actually reclaim our African minds, we will do to them what they have done to us, that we will do what happened in Haiti will happen here. That's why they try so hard to decrease our numbers and to underestimate our numbers. I actually think that the census underestimates the actual number of Africans here in America in some places. Not in all places, but in some places, I think that they underreport the number of Africans that are actually here.
Well said. I mean, think about it. If you're at war, and one of the greatest, for lack of a better term, one of the most important things in a war is information, and the culling of that information, the deception of that information, what they call dis or misinformation, actually has more impact and has a more defining edge to anyone that's at war. Europeans have been in war not only with us, but they've been in war with the entire globe. Okay, and not just Europeans, I talk them and their ilk. If you go through their history, or Dr. Laila Afrika said, you want to see the history of the European, follow the trail of blood. The thing is I look at it in terms, like I said, they're in a war with the planet. Anything that is molested, that is altered, that is destroyed, everything from the smallest, which is the atom, to everything in outer space, we call it SpaceX, and everything in between, it's all junked. It's all been exploited. It's all been, it's all been, hurt. They've literally doctored, and everything, like I said, from the smallest, which is the proton and the electron and the neutron, to the outer space and everything in between is not safe. There's nothing sacred to them. So the thing is knowing that that exists. One of the things that Dr. Bobby E. Wright said so well that I think we as African people, as Black folks, because of the fact that we've never seen such bestial nature, that it's hard for us to succumb to those ways in terms of, of vile activity. But Dr. Bobby E. Wright said blood debts can only be repaid in blood. The only thing that a beast understands is the bestial nature of what it is, and it has to be gotten rid of. It cannot, you cannot live in harmony with the roach. It must be killed. That's the only solution. You can't live in harmony with individuals that say, "Oh, you guys are just victims, man. You just," because those type of individuals want you to be a victim. Therefore, they're trying to impart in your psyche that, hey, well, maybe in other words, it's like a sick reverse psychology. It's like Jeffrey Dahmer saying, "Hey, man, you're just pissed off because you look like a hamburger." These individuals must be destroyed. They must be killed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. These are things, like I say, I can't call them people. I can't call them human, because human, you must have humanity. And anything that destroys anything from the smallest, the atom, to outer space and in between, there is no humanity. There's nothing sacred. There's nothing godly or earthly about them. It's something that just must not exist. Okay, my dad told me this. Okay, Sister Major, my dad said, the moment that one of these beasts go to another planet, and if they could take off that helmet and go, then that planet is dead. The moment that they can get on any other planet and take one breath, you best believe that that planet will not exist. Because the first thing they'll do, you look at what's happened to this planet, and you can best believe, with the technology and the bestial nature that has been crystallized and amplified and perfected over centuries, you best believe the destruction they did here would be done probably in another planet in 3 days. Can you imagine Elon Musk on Mars? If you could take his helmet off on Mars, Mars would be blown up within a week. That's just the nature of what we're dealing with. Thus, the only solution is the complete eradication, as Dr. Kamal Cambone said, the complete, thorough eradication of these individuals, irrespective of us going ahead and having the accoutrements of our Netflix and our egos and the things that they've created. No, the only solution is for them to disappear. But I'll pass the mic.
I absolutely agree. We have to eradicate white people from from the world, and it's a consciousness that goes along with that, because there are some people in black skin that are effectively also white people because they look at the world through white eyes. I think that we have to begin to discern better what is a white person, and we have to be able to purge them from our stratosphere, purge them from our area of being, so that we can restore African world order, because we are the ones that are in harmony with nature. We are the ones that were given the mandate to have dominion over the earth and everything in it. We are the ones that have the balancing and correcting power. That is us. We have to get back to the point where we reclaim our rightful place in this structure, and we stop allowing them to project onto us the identity that they want us to have. They continue to try to talk us into being some type of subservient, submissive. They try to make our men effeminate. They try to masculinize our women. They try to make our entire way of being turned upside down because it fits their narrative. It fits into what their world order is. But that's not how we really are. We are co-rulers of this planet together. And we have to embrace that and stop allowing them to tell us what we are and are not. We have to be the ones to define this existence for ourselves.
Exactly. It comes down to a thing of what I call self-preservation. And nature has a way of trying to preserve itself. We saw it earlier today with all the fracking and all the disruption, that happens on this planet. Less than 90 miles from where I'm at, they had an earthquake, because of the fact that it was, it's the world's way of saying, look, I got to get better. I got sick for something made me sick. I must be better. And I tend to think, when I see what has this planet, look at all the extinctions that had happened within the last 100 years, within the last 10 years. Now think of the extinctions that had happened since our competitor, I call him my competitor. Think of all the extinctions of animals, of plants, of things that have been around for millions of years because of a species that's here. So it's not a thing of just an emotive or ethnic or whatever. I see things in terms of what my dad said. He says, you always see things in justice. He says, it's not that you want to do things for black folk, it's that you're doing things because if something's not right, you want to make it better. My brother told me that. He said, man, at all the things that I've known, anytime you got in issues with cops or anything else, is because you were trying to do the right thing, standing up for folks. So I look at that in terms of this planet. Of course, I look at that in terms of African people, but I say something on this planet is destroying everything that exists. Doesn't matter what it is. Anything it comes in contact with, it destroys. That's just its nature. So if I know that exists and I don't do anything about it, then I become part and parcel. In other words, I'm an accessory to the crime. I think of it this way. I always like to tease folks in terms of ethnicities and whatnot. And I talk to my mom, and I like to. A lot of folks don't get it in terms of where the different quote unquote, I call it species, because we're different species of biped. There's no such thing as we're all human. That to me is a nonsense. It's complete. It's like you might have a cat, you might have a house cat, a leopard, and a cheetah. They might be felines, but they're different species. Okay, and that's the thing about, like, I like to impart that to African people, because the more and more we start thinking and acting in that kind of concept, the more and more we get more in terms of protecting, quote unquote, our species. And the reason I brought that out is I talk about these different species. I say, if you hand the species of what they call Asia, if you went out and you told the individual, the species of Asia, and said, hey, build something, and say these three species are like 3-year-old children. You get the Asian child, that species will go ahead and might build some artwork. And that artwork, you give that little Asian child a hammer. That child will use that hammer to build some kind of artwork. And because that's their species, like the Acelius, Dr. Marimba Ani would say, that's kind of what their species kind of concentrates on, is that art mentality. It's a different, it's a whole different thing than other species. Then if you handed the species the hammer to a child, they would call it of the Western Hemisphere. Back in the day, they called it the Indian or whatever, but they had their own things. They were Maya, they were Olmecs, they were they had all kinds of different names for themselves. But if you handed that species of child a hammer, that child would probably get something more symbolic with nature. My brother the wolf, the brother the owl, whatever. And it would be that hammer would represent something within nature. It might build something, might build a totem pole. Who knows? But the thing is that's what that species of child would do. You hand the African child the same hammer, and you say, "Build me something." That child will build music. It'll build joy, celebration. It would build jubilee. It would build, because that's who we are as an African people. We like to dance. We like to that's just our nature. We like to celebrate. We're a celebratory people all the time, even if it's good time at the Apollo, showtime at the Apollo. We still like to laugh. We still like to clown, and we still like to that's just who we are. If you took the same hammer and handed it to the European, that species, the one that lives out of that came out of the caves, and I'm talking all of its ilk, all of that includes Arabs and everything else. If you handed that same hammer to the European species and its subspecies, it would take the hammer, hit the Asian over the head, hit the native over the head, and hit the African over the head, take all of their stuff and claim it and says, look what I created. This is exactly what we're dealing with, because it has done that, but it hit the Asian over the head. That's why you had Tom Cruise as The Last Samurai. It hit the native over its head. That's why they call themselves Native American. And they hit the African over the head and say they're Eminem, and now they're the rap gods. In other words, we're dealing with something that should not be. And until we come to that fact, systemation, that we as African people are dealing with something that must be eradicated, then sooner or later we will be the eradicated, and we'll be regretting it if we even have a chance to be around to do it. I'll pass the mic.
I absolutely agree, because if we don't do something about this white man and things that he's doing to all people of the planet, then he's going to extract and take until there's nothing left, because that's his nature. He has an all-consuming hunger, and there's nothing that can satiate it. And we have to get to the point where we understand that there's no bargaining with these people. There's no getting along with them. There's no harmony that can be reached with them, because they are inherently anti-nature. They are against creation. They are defying creation at every single step of the way. And they are not trying in any way, shape, form, or fashion to balance nature. They want to destroy nature and everything that is natural. They want to take, own, and control. They would rather see the world destroyed versus seeing someone else control it, which is why they're on this suicide mission. That's why they create murder cults. That's why they create all of these weapons of destruction, because that's their nature: to destroy, to tear, to consume. That's who they are.
Exactly. It's up. The fact that we recognize this, it's if those of us who are not planning to do whatever it is to reverse that or to end it are culpable in the crimes of whatever happens after that. And I try to tell folks, like, because we, unfortunately, many of our folks find a measure of comfort. In other words, it's saying, well, as long as I can live, quote unquote, in this pseudo form of harmony with these animals, then maybe those animals will not eat me one day. It does not matter whether you're Bill Cosby. Doesn't matter. They're going to eat you. Okay, whether you're Gayle King, sooner or later that animal will say, "Hey, it's like the old story of the frog and the scorpion. When the scorpion asked the frog to give him a lift, going over the water, the frog said, "Hey, no problem. I'll do this for you." And then all of a sudden, the scorpion stings the frog, and they both die. And the frog says, "Why'd you do this?" And the scorpion says, "That's what I do. I sting for a living." Until we recognize that, I think that we're in a very perilous scenario, not just as Africans, but I think the world at large. And the only thing that could be done is the complete eradication of that problem. It's almost like a virus. Like you said, they have an insatiable appetite for control and destruction. Well, so does a virus. And, until the world, and in particular African people, recognize and act accordingly, that we are definitely, involved with the virus, that virus either will go away, or the virus will consume it and destroy the host. And I don't want to be destroyed. The only thing I can think of is, again, Dr. Kamal Cambone said, is devising a way to go ahead and eradicate him.
Yeah. And that's the only real option that we have. And there is a mindset that goes along with that we have to be able to purge out. We have to be so rooted and entrenched in our African way of being, in our axiological framework and our epistemological framework, from our perspective, that we do not allow them to continue to shake us, and that we can continue to let this planet heal, and as we heal ourselves, and thrive, instead of being in a position where they are in control, consuming everything, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to consume everything until there's nothing left. And then they're going to try to extract. And then they're going to snort the mummy dust bones, like they did with the mummies back in the Victorian era.
Right. I mean, I'm glad you brought up mummies. This is something I used to do this video every year for folks, and hopefully folks would have gotten the message. one thing that when we're dealing with something like I said, if you gave the hammer to all three of them, and one the European and its ilk, that includes Arabs, that includes all those that are the Europeans ilk, they're progeny, I guess the word would be. One thing that I noticed is, and I'm glad you brought up mummies because that's very important. Anytime when somebody is going to claim something as an ancestor, they revere that ancestor and they let that ancestor sleep in the ground that they put the ancestor in forever. When I hear again the fact that we're dealing with something like a virus that likes to take cultures and claim it as its own, or take things that folks may even use as the term culture, we just call it hip hop, and they'll try to claim it as their own. Here's what I mean. If you notice, like everybody knows when they this when they call ancient Egypt, which is called Kemet, everybody knows that this term ancient Egypt, and you see how they've tried to claim that is their ancestry. Now, here's the thing that I've been putting videos like this for years. I've been trying to get this through folks' heads. Anytime you put your ancestry in their resting ground, every species, including elephants, even hyenas, when they know that they're dead, they have there's animals will go ahead and revere the dead because they know that, hey, you were part of our existence as a species. You see a lot of animals do that, even crows. Animals have a way of revering, and I'm not saying that they bury their dead like humans, but they have a graveyard that they recognize that, hey, you were part of the pack, you were part of the herd, and they know that that's a very sacred scenario. Now, humans just do it with graveyards, they do it with pyramids, they do it with you name it, a mosque, they do it, or mausoleums.
Mounds and
It
mausoleums.
clearly, yeah, mausoleums, yeah, but clearly that's kind of a way almost no different than an elephant's graveyard. Now, the thing about Europeans in their ilk, and like I said, I include Arabs. Anytime somebody digs up something that is a revered someone that's made the afterlife, clearly that individual is taking the culture of something. In other words, how many Europeans like and Arabs that like to dig up, like, oh, this ancient, Egyptian and ancient, and we are part of that. How many of these folks do you know dug up George Washington's grave, or Thomas Jefferson's grave, or even Elvis Presley? You will never see that. Okay, you will never see it. 300 years from now, they will never go ahead some archaeological dig and trade. Oh, this was Elvis Presley. No, because they know when you put something in the ground, that individual's in the ground. So why do they go around talking about, oh, we're digging up our ancestors in Egypt? It kind of tells you that virus-like culture that we're dealing with. That's why I always tell folks, anytime somebody tells you that Arabs or Europeans, and I mean, I never fight with, like I say, I never fight with these irrational beings, because if you fight if you fight a pig in a pigsty, you both get dirty, and he's gonna, that's his ground. Okay, that's his home turf. Like they say, never debate with an idiot because he'll beat you down, and with experience. That that's just something that I tend to like when individuals go ahead and say, well, you guys are victims, you just victim mentality. It's hard for me to debate with an idiot because I know that I'm dealing with a virus. I'm dealing with something that should not be. But I'll pass the mic there.
We have to get to the point where we are confronting these issues head on, where we are not confronting the idiots, not confronting the people that don't know any better, the people that are trying to drag us down, but we're confronting the real issue, the fact that they continue to try to erase our past, the fact that they continue to try to brainwash us. Speaking of which, that's the next big book I'll be reading. Brainwashed by oh my gosh, Tony Browder made the recommendation. I forgot the author, but we'll be reading Brainwashed soon. And we have to get to the point where we stop allowing them to brainwash us. We know the truth, and we have to dig deeper into the truths that we know so that we can sit and pick out the reality of what it is we need to do, of what our next step is. Are you armed? These are questions you should ask yourself. Do you know how to use the weapons that you have? What type of health regimen are you on? What type of diet are you eating? Are you in peak physical condition? Because it's going to come down to that type of warfare with these people. And we're not getting we're not getting further away from it. We're getting closer and closer to it as they continue to spiral into this cycle of destruction. And that's ultimately what they think that they're afraid of, but ultimately I think on the subconscious level it's what they want, which is why they create murder cults.
Exactly. Exactly. It's almost like I always say, misery doesn't like they all the term misery loves company. Um, misery don't not only wants company, misery wants an entire neighborhood. Okay, misery just a psychopath doesn't just want to go out and say, okay, it was just me. A psychopath wants to kill everything. A socio-psychopath wants to kill everything in the vicinity, just because it knows that it should not be. I mean, it knows, hey, I'm an anomaly on this planet. I should not have been born. I should have not have been created. That's and what we're seeing is this cycle of madness that these species. Again, I don't call them people because you got different species. The cycle of madness that the species is coming to an end game, to where it knows that its days are numbered, and that's what really really frightens me because it has convinced those of us who should know better that it'll be here forever and for us to try to be like it, and that's very damaging. It's very dangerous. Okay, when you see a psychopath in its end days and it doesn't have much time, that's when you want to go ahead and if that psychopath lives 3,000 miles from you, that's too close. You must move to the other side of the planet because you know what it's capable of. And that's the end game. They're in an end game scenario or an end stage of their so-called imperialistic dreams, and that is the most dangerous. I think it's a statement in Kenya. I think it's a proverb that says, "What is it? A dying mule is the most dangerous. Like a kicking dying mule is when it's at its most dangerous." And that's kind of what we're seeing into this entire European sphere. Is there a dying mule and it's kicking, and that's when, if anything, the revelation for those of us who are Africans should say, okay, now we shouldn't have never been around them in the first place, but now we know that they're on this end stage environment that they're going to be completely mad. I'm talking about insanity mad. And the thing that's unfortunate is like frogs in a boiling pot. It's so subtle right now that many of our folk won't recognize it. Our Stephen A. Smiths, or even our Denzel Washingtons, we won't. They won't recognize it. It's like, oh no, I don't see these signs. But if we see it, sooner or later we'll be coming, and that's and sooner or later the next generation will be it, and that's the real scary part. Right now is where the world is already seeing it, but we're not seeing it. That we're dealing with something that is literally fixing to blow everything up, and just because. And it needs to be put down as quickly as possible and liquidated as fast as we can liquidate it. Otherwise, I don't see much hope for the planet whatsoever. I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, we are the only hope for the planet. Our coming back into ourselves and our taking control of this situation, we are the only hope for this planet because they recognize that they're destroying the planet because they can't continue to hold control. Black and brown people, and black people specifically, but brown people in generally, are coming into a sense of, wait a minute, these guys are the enemy. These guys are our common enemy. And even if they don't align with black people, black equals African people, those people are aligning with themselves and they are recognizing that this is an enemy of mine. And when these white people realize that they're surrounded by people that see them as an enemy, even if they don't link up and link arms and come together as strategic temporary allies, then they will still be turning their backs on this white man. And that, I think, their fear of being alone and being out there by themselves, I think, is another fear that they have that's deep seated within them. I think that they want to be near us because if we decided to leave, if we decided to take all our toys and leave, they would be alone. And I think that that is something that they are definitely afraid of.
Sister, I keep telling folks to watch the movie Man Friday. What you just said is what that movie Man Friday was all about. It was done back in 1975 when I first saw it, and I'll never forget that. I was downstairs in my mom's living room, and I was like, man, this show is incredible. And it was a movie. It was only had really two actors in it, Richard Roundtree and Richard Chamberlain. And the whole premise of this was this European was trying to indoctrinate this native African into its ways, into its so-called religions, the whole nine yards. It was trying to turn this African into a Stacey Dash or a Charles Barkley. It did everything it can to try to indoctrinate through religion, through what you eat, through what you wear, how you talk. And this European, the African started seeing, hey, this thing is mad. Okay, it's insanity. And what had happened is through the whole thing, you see this you see exactly what's happened to African people in that entire movie. Basically, Sister Matron, is that movie was actually viewed back in the day. And remember, this is 75. It was viewed by Cold War nations in order to go ahead and delink themselves from the U.S. in terms of, because they said that the United States would implode from within. It was a Soviet premier said that, and this is after you had like China, you had Cuba, you had all these other folks watch this movie, Man Friday. It was a little TV movie, and it was made in the United States. But it was a movie for African people to delink ourselves, because at the end of that movie, what it did is it showed how to destroy your enemy without firing a shot. It was showing you how can you go ahead and delink yourself from your enemy, because sooner or later your enemy is going to kill themselves. And the reason is, at the end of the movie, you saw the European, as you said, they're afraid to be alone. You saw them alone. And you saw the madness of what he was going through, because he was now alone, and something he never wanted to be. And because remember, he wanted a slave. He wanted somebody to revere him. He wanted somebody to always say that I'm going to sculpt, I'm going to be your frame of reference. Well, that did not happen. Once the African left, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, because I keep telling folks it's not just a movie for like 1970s entertainment. It was a movie that was viewed by nations who are now controlled. Russia, China, North Korea, all these nations viewed this stuff back then. And they used the same model in order to free themselves. Yet the movie was based for African people to free ourselves. But the thing at the very end is you saw the madness and what happened at the end of the movie, because the European was alone. He did not have an audience, because a psychopath and a sociopath needs an audience. That's why they do what they do. When he didn't have that audience, he was self-destructive. And again, what you said speaks volumes. Unfortunately, we as African people, letting individuals like that have real estate in our minds, we're giving them an audience. When you see the fact, why do you see their so-called media always putting things in our face that have to do with us? You know, whether it's good, bad, or other, doesn't matter. Whether it's a celebrity or a 17-year-old that was defending himself, you know, being plastered all over their media. They want us to make sure that they're not alone. So they want to make sure that we are their audience. Unless we start to realize that, then not only will we be our audience, but we'll be what's called a captive audience. And that's not a good place to be. I'll pass the mic.
Absolutely. And that being their audience has been the position that they've always wanted us in, because they wanted us to be the type of consumer that they were. But they wanted us to be idle consumers, generating revenue, because we're so busy being distracted by the medium of entertainment they put in front of us, that we just get up, go to work, give them our money, and come back and repeat. Get up, go to work, give them our money, and repeat continuously. We pay them for rent, we pay them for our utility bills, we pay them for our entertainment. So they are looking for ways to continue to keep us on this consumerist path, when in fact, if we detract from that, if we pick up books and start reading books, if we turn into our family, if we start turning into our friends, and we start doing those things that build community, that's when they get worried. That's when they have something. What y'all doing over there? They always want to come figure out what we doing. And this is something that has been a problem for us with them from the very beginning, because they come in like a passive observer. And once they get beyond that passive observer phase, then they look for ways to try to control us. And then they pathologize every aspect of our being. And then after they have pathologized every aspect of our being, they then say, now we control you. So it's this weird, sick cycle that they set up in their minds, because they can't stand to be alone. They study us in an attempt to control us, because they don't want to be away from or alone without us. And like you said, that young brother Carmelo that was defending himself, he was being bullied. There have been others that have come out and said, "Oh no, he wasn't being bullied. Why did he have a knife?" I don't care why he had a knife. Boys carry knives all the time. Boys of a certain age carry knives all the time. And the fact that he was in this situation where he was being bullied, where he was being manhandled, and he needed to defend himself, and he did defend himself. He stood his ground. There's nothing wrong with what he did to defend himself. It's unfortunate that this guy fucked around and found out that you shouldn't pick on people in this way, and that his twin brother was watching him go through this. That's messed up. But him and his twin were sitting there picking on him. They were the neighborhood bullies. So one of them got what he deserved, and the other one went into shock. That's just what happens when you mess around with the wrong person. And they needed to learn this very valuable lesson.
Exactly. One of the things that I like to tell folks is, and I was listening to Dr. Ma'at, and I understand because this is how colonized we've become. We tend to rationalize we rationalize the obvious. In other words, when I say rationalize the obvious, we do it as in a way to explain why we do what we do, as if we were trying to tell others, you have to come and see our logic. When it came to that young brother, I don't rationalize, and I don't you will never hear me say, well, this is why he had to. No, because common sense, I never tell people why I breathe. I do it just because it's natural. Okay? This young brother did what was natural. Okay? Something that I hope that many of us other brothers will do. It's natural. Like an animal does what it's natural. It's called self-preservation. And so I cannot sit there, and some people, when I was listening to this yesterday, I heard individuals talking about, they're rationalizing, well, he had to do this. No, it's like me trying to say, well, the reason I have to breathe is no, this is just, hey, the fact that there was somebody that was his competitor that was in the same airspace as him, that breathed the same air, this young brother was supposed to do, because it's like breathing. You have an enemy, you have an animal. If a lion sees a hyena, it's not going to rationalize why it kills it. It says, wait, this is what I do. It's hopefully we as brothers will get to the same mindset, at least as Carmelo, to say, hey, this has nothing to do with why I'm doing things. This is just like breathing. My enemy has to die. It's not a thing of like, oh, they did this or he did that or what. No, it's that, hey, he's just got to die because he is. It's not anything he does or anything, but what we've done is we've been colonized, Sister Matron, so much as African people that we have to have a rationalization is why we exist amongst our enemies. That doesn't, and I understand that what has been done to us, but at this late stage of the game, the only reason why someone has to die is because they're taking the same air as I am, and it has nothing to do with what they did or what they may do or what they might do or what they might want to do or the fact that what they've done. No, it's the fact that they breathe, the fact that they exist, that they have to go, and that's what nature has done. This is not. I think what happened is we become too, quote unquote, indoctrinated with what they call European intelligence, where we have to rationalize our being or rationalize nature or quantify why certain things must exist and why they must. No, that doesn't matter. Nature says, hey, you got to be around. It's called self-preservation. And if something is even a perception of an enemy, you kill it. That's the bottom line. You just get rid of it. Because nature, I've never seen a deer perceive whether a wolf is going to be nice or not, or what that wolf may have done in the past and might not do now. No, the deer says, I got to get the hell out of here. Okay, or I'll use my horns to fight it. But one way or the other, I'm not sleeping with wolves. That's just unfortunately, I think we've been so-called intellectually indoctrinated in the European mindset, whereas you never see that at a European. The moment that they even thought that there was a young black male at 15 years old that said that a white female, I don't call them women, a white female says he whistled at me, they didn't rationalize and say, okay, well, it's something he must have did. No, they just went in and said, where's he live? We got to kill him. Bottom line, what's his name? Oh, Emmett Till, we don't care what his name. Where's he at? We'll find the first one we can see and kill it. And then we'll say, okay, whatever. But hey, it's a competitor to us. It has to die. hopefully we as African people will soon get to that mindset. And I tell Sister Matron, I've been telling brothers this because a lot of that mindset has been eviscerated out of those that need it the most, and that's black men or black males. Here's what I mean. I did a lot of radio shows over 20 years ago, and we would do these radio shows, these forums, and this is pre YouTube stuff like that, pre Blog Talk. And I never forget, it was called the Day of Outrage Radio, and I said, look, I asked, my dad was on the panel. There was a couple of other elders. There was a real good brother that I know out of New Jersey, Brother Nat. There was a lot of us because he hosted the show. And I asked the brothers, and I said, could you kill a cracker? And they were like, whoa, where's this coming from? And I said, no, I was listening to Dr. Kamal Cambone, and I was like, he made sense. I said, could you kill a cracker? And all the brothers, I said, I'm gonna ask each one of you this question. And I asked one, and I asked another, and I asked them, and one brother would come up and says, well, if he did this and that, I could see the justification. One came up and says, well, the karmic recompense, I can't just go out and do this and that to folks without, I said, I understand. One brother came in and he's like, well, I could do it and I'd like to do it, but, I really, the blowback, I have to plan this, I want to make sure that this doesn't happen. My dad got on. And my dad was like, well, son, I understand what you're about. My dad was definitely black oriented. He was definitely black centered. He says, I understand what you're saying, son. I understand. Sometimes we have to, we have to rationalize. It was a lot of loquacious, very, palabra. And I don't mind that. I understand that's where we come from because that's what we've been indoctrinated into. So then I asked and then they asked me, well, could you kill a cracker? I said, yeah. But I even got the answer wrong. I tell brothers this all the time. I got the answer wrong when I said yes. They said, okay, well, could you kill crack? I said, yeah. But when I said I got it wrong, I did get it wrong when I said yes. Yes was the wrong answer. It was only one brother, Sister Matron, that got the answer right when I said, could you kill a cracker? The only brother. I'll never forget him because I could hear his voice right now in my head. He didn't say yes. He didn't say if. He didn't say because of. He didn't say, well, if they, he said one 4-letter word that makes more sense than anything that everybody on that panel said. And he said the word when. W-H-E-N, when. Here's what I mean. Anytime when somebody asks you a question and you have to give a binary answer, yes or no, if this, if then that, because I program computers. So we deal a lot with logic. That means that you've already resigned to the fact that there could be another way out. The word when is not a binary answer. The word when says you've already decided to do it. You just need, hey, you want me to do it now or after dinner? It's going to be done. It's like breathing. You don't say, I'm going to breathe if, I'm going to sleep if, I'm going to eat if. It's natural. It's unconscious. You know that you've already resigned that you have to do it. When that brother said when, what he was saying is, yeah, it's more of an affirmative way of saying yes. It's already done. And that's what we're dealing with somebody who is bred, like literally bred not only us and their enslavement, but bred us out of African concept, Africanness, African people. They have bred us out of who we are and bred us into who they are. So the word when, it should just be natural. I'll pass the mic.
You're absolutely right. And when you say they have bred us out, that's what this whole FBA thing and ADOS thing is about. These people are trying to assert that lineage that began in 1808, that lineage that began at the height of our enslavement as a Caucasian creation, and anyone that's trying to assert that as an identity is insane because you cannot assert something that your oppressor, that your enemy created as your lineage, because then you are putting yourself in a state of permanent subjugation to them. And we have to get beyond that, which is why we need to know these dates and understand this perspective. But we need to be able to purge and cleanse it from our consciousness so that we know and understand, oh, okay, your perspective is that you started with slavery and that slavery is your beginning. You don't tap into the greatness of who you are as an African. You don't tap into and reconnect. I'd like to see the DNA tests of a lot of these different people to see how much African blood they have running through their veins while they try to claim that they're FBA or ADOS or something other than this Eurasian creation, because this, in fact, is the problem. This, in fact, is the genesis of their challenge. They don't want to accept the fact that they are Africans. They want to accept the fact that the white man made them.
Yeah, their frame of reference, and my mom always told me about that for years. She's been telling me that for, gosh, probably 30 years. Frame of reference is everything. Okay, how you frame yourself, and how you frame your environment, how you frame your history or your record, as I call it, how you frame things is more important than anything else, because that tells you who you are and what you're going to be. It tells you what you've been and what you would like to be. And the fact that I'm glad you brought up these I always call them clowns, these FBAs and these ADOSs in there, of what they identified. It's like the term African American. I never use that term. A lot of black folks, they get, or African people get a little upset. Diasporans, they're like, "No, I'm an African American. I understand." But if they're using that, I'm gonna use the same European language, which is not our language. I'm gonna use that same language to say, okay, if you use those terms, African American, no different than these so-called FBAs or whatever. I ask them, what is the noun and what is the adjective? Okay, I mean, I ask them that. What is the noun of the term? And this is, remember, this is European terms, the European identity or European definitions. You have what's called a noun and you have what's called an adjective. The term African American or FBA, whatever they call themselves, I look at what's the noun. Okay, African American. That term. What is the adjective? They're using the term African as an adjective. And that African, or I should say, an adjective is abstract. It is not something tangible. It is not something you could touch, hold, taste, smell, see, hear. It's like an adjective. My blue may be brother forecast aqua. My yellow may be your orange. So therefore, it's very abstract. It's not a definitive term. It's very indefinite. Okay, it could be anything. The thing is, unfortunately, we're using African as an adjective, where that should be the noun, because African is deterministic. It is defined. Yet, because we've been so colonized, no different than those FBAs or whatever else, that we're using the very thing we should use as African people is the definitive nature of who we are. We're using it as something abstract. Like, I could have a chair, it could be yellow, it could be red or whatever else, but the chair is the noun. It is the definitive thing. The color that describes it is abstract. We have done that so to the point that now we've got these clowns running around talking about their Aboriginal or their indigenous to FBA or ADOS, whatever they call themselves. They have no definition. In other words, their noun is something somebody else created for them. Their noun. What do you think would happen if United Snakes, no different than they changed their determination of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, what do you think would happen if they say, we're not going to we're going to change this term from America. We're not going to use it anymore. We're going to call it white man. Okay, we're going to call it Ku Klux Klan now. We're not going to, from now on, we're going to call it United States of Caucasia, Caucasia. What's going to happen to these, I call them clowns, of these, what they call foundational Black Americans? What are they going to, now they're foundational Black Caucasians? I mean, like Malcolm X said it best. You can put cats in the ovens, but they're not going to come out as biscuits. And only the individuals that have no frame of reference of who they are as African people are always going to be in the oven trying to come out as biscuits. I'll pass the mic.
Absolutely. And we have too many people trying to come out as biscuits, trying to get some butter biscuits, making an attempt to get something for themselves, making up identities for people that are lost. And these people really should be purged out of our community, because they're just as bad as having a white person amongst you, because they're taking people down a path of understanding identity and discovery that leads nowhere. There's no benefit for these people to classify themselves as ADOS, FBA, even the African American moniker. These things don't have real meaning. I designate myself as an African in America. I've been here for generations. My, And we have to get to the point where we are first Africans instead of being anything other than Africans. We are Africans in Brazil. We are Africans in Trinidad. We are Africans in Barbados. We are Africans wherever we are. We are first and foremost Africans. It's just a boat ride, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke. It's just a boat stop that changed where we actually are. We're still Africans.
Yeah, I mean, I may live, or I should say reside, because no one really lives in their oppressors stolen territory. You reside there. You might not. A lot of folks. Where do you live? Oh, I live in Ohio. No, you reside there. Okay, because you're not living. You just unless you own and control everything in that place they call Ohio, you just someone who contributes to somebody else's wealth or somebody else's world. But the thing is one of the things that I tell folks, I say, I may live in a house, I may live in a condo. That does not make me a black condoan. Like, you may live in a place or reside in a place called America Kaka. You may live in a hotel. You may live in a shoebox. You're not a black shoebox. You're not a black hotelian. You're not, again, it's about frame of reference and what's been, when you talk about the slave coast and the breeding, so much has been bred out of us. The thing that's been bred out of us most than anything is common sense and the wish for survival. The quest for self-preservation is what's been bred out of us the most, and that's the most dangerous thing to be bred out of. That quest for not just self-preservation in a physical form, self-preservation in terms of a cultural form, in a spiritual form, a self-preservation in educational form, in a term of family units. In terms, when I say a family unit, that's the family unit is what represents your future. It also represents your past. It represents the things that your past could give to your future, and also what you're doing in the present because of what you learned in the past, and because of what you want out of the future. That's been bred out of us. The Slave Coast is not just a book. It's not just it's literally a blueprint, for lack of a better term, is what's happened to us, and a blueprint someone else has done for their own self-preservation and for their conquering that unfortunately we were subjected to. And now that we're living that, unfortunately we're adhering to it, and we've normalized that, which is even more disastrous, is normalizing what someone else has done to you and then thinking that that's the way things should be. That is not only self-destruction, but that's basically that's like the beyond what anything self-destruction could ever bring. I'll pass the mic.
Yes, and thinking of the slave coast, knowing that this was all done just to increase their profits. Every positive thing that we can think that they've ever done that impacted us in a good way was done just to increase their profits. Slave breeding, which was not a good thing, was done just to increase their profits. They wanted to increase how much money they had. They wanted to increase their capital. Ending the transatlantic slave trade was about economy protectionism for people like Thomas Jefferson. Um, ending ending the uh, ending the intracontinental slave trade was just about them being able to generate more money for the slaves that they were breeding, because he owned over 600 slaves. So he was in a position to capitalize off of the intra-America slave trade. And we have to acknowledge the fact that these American icons and people we've been told to look up to as heroes are actually monsters.
Yeah, you're dealing with. I think it's Brother Baruti or maybe Sister Marimba, and he said it. The only thing that's changed with the European is the calendar date. Okay, Jeffrey Dahmer is no different than Henry VIII. Okay, or any of their so-called folks that they revere. They're Thomas Jeffersons. It doesn't matter. The only thing that's the only difference between the European of old and the European now is the fact that they in the European year it's just a different year. And that they got more technology. Elon Musk is no different than Hitler. That's why he gets a Hitler salute. So it's the thing is it's high time for the African to recognize for self-preservation principles that fear of these species And the amalgamate into them because of the inherent fear that we have of them is more suicidal than actually dealing with it the way it should be dealt with, and that's a complete eradication of it.
Absolutely. Because I have said many times that integration, amalgamation, and miscegenation are all paths to slow death and self destruction. When you decide to procreate with these people across species lines, you're putting yourself in a position where you are breeding out your African self and you are creating another type of man. You are creating another type of being, another species. And you don't have the wherewithal to re-Africanize that child that you create with that species, because that child is going to see the power structure, and like any entity, they're going to try to integrate themselves into the power structure because my parent did it. Because my parent did it. You are laying the framework for self-destruction.
I think of it in terms of the difference of species. I look at the Hispanic, for instance. There is not one on this planet that is of their original species. Not one. And therefore, they're going to have a different culture because of that. They have a different, everything from language to food, everything from religion. It's not the same species. That species that they came from no longer exists. Whether that species was a Maya, was an Olmec, was an Aztec, was a a Mayan, it doesn't matter what it is. It ceased to exist, and all the things that brought those cultures also ceased to exist. So when I talk in terms of extinction, the European made extinction its religion, not just the extinction of like, oh yeah, we got rid of this animal and that animal or this and that. Everything that lives is in jeopardy, as in danger to something that's whole religion is about extinction. Extinction of a species, extinction of a culture, extinction of a language, extinction of a religion, extinction of just about every social and unsocial norm, for lack of a better term. That's just the nature of what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with, I should say that's just the unnatural nature of something we're dealing with. Hopefully the African will see that before it's too late.
Hopefully we will, but looking at our history, we want to see the humanity in everyone. They even studied us to say that we are people that like to breed with other types of things, that we like to marry out. Exonomous is what they call it, where we like to marry something different. And that is a part of their documented observations of us. And I think that that is to our peril. We are friendly to foreigners. That is to our peril. We are welcoming to strangers. That is to our peril. And we have to stop that particular aspect and turn into ourselves and become friends of ourselves and of each other again so that we can actually survive.
Well said. Self-preservation is the key to common sense. And unfortunately, due to fear, due to self-hate, due to apathy, due to the quest of assimilation, due to a lot of things, that self-preservation mechanism is more in jeopardy than it was when we knew what we were up against. When we knew it's a serious flaw, for lack of a better term, in today's environment. And that flaw, unfortunately, is the fact that we have not resigned to get rid of the problem in the first place. Dr. Kamal Cambone said it. The only way that we'll survive this is somebody's got to go. And the only folks that know that are the ones that are trying to make us go, for lack of a better term, in the first place. And it's coming down to either we survive or those that we've let survive will survive. And sooner or later, a lot of our folk are just going to have to resign to the fact that, hey, something's got to go. Hopefully it won't be us.
Hopefully. I don't think that it will be us. I think that our consciousness is strong, and that once we reclaim our minds, we'll be in a position to assert the dominance and control that we should have over this planet. I think that we will continue to have these conversations and do things and take active steps toward our liberation and freedom in an attempt to face off this white man face to face instead of continuing to cower in front of him.
Thank you. You know what? You are the only person outside of myself talking about controlling the planet. I know there's hope. I have yet to many more of our folks. I said, look, we must control this planet. It's not a thing of freedom and justice and all that. No, I want this whole globe. I want it back to us. I'm gonna let you go there, sister. Sister Mation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming up, MG2. I appreciate you and value your input. You're so insightful. It's always a pleasure. As he said, we have to control this planet. This is our planet. I used to remind you that I wanted my planet back, Black man. And we have to get to the point where we understand that it is our job to be stewards of this planet. We have to get to the point that we recognize that we are not some subservient creation of this white man, but that we are the inheritors of the earth, that it is our job to take control. I want to thank each and every one of you that tuned in tonight. I know Anthony McPhail is listening. I thank Sister Ra and the elders that listen with her. I thank Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast. I thank the Forecast for being here. I definitely thank MG2 for coming up. I know Anthony McPhail is listening. I thank KW Don 7 for tuning in tonight and so many others. I value your opinions, your feedback, your input. We'll be starting on page 21 next Monday at 9 p.m. Thank you for tuning in and thank you for listening. And there's one thing that I want you to remember.
Every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history.
Did you hear that? Everything that touches your life has to be an instrument of your liberation. It is a tool to help you free yourself because that is what you were born to do. All right, guys, I'll talk to you tomorrow. We'll be reading The Falsification of African Consciousness at 8 p.m. Peace.